It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. A peaceful park bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, a quiet bench where a woman could simply breathe and let the weight of the world melt away. But that fragile peace shattered the moment a man in uniform appeared. A man sworn to protect, but who instead chose to prey. In a matter of minutes, what began as a serene escape turned into a nightmare of abuse, manipulation, and unchecked power. For Lila, it was a confrontation she never anticipated. For Jonas, it was a test of everything he stood for as a police captain and as a husband. The stakes were high, the tension suffocating, and the consequences were life-altering. Before we dive into this gripping story of courage, corruption, and the fight for justice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you find this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales like this one. The park lay bathed in the soft, warm glow of the setting sun. The golden rays filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled patterns on the winding paths below. It was a place where time seemed to slow, a sanctuary for those seeking a break from the bustling demands of daily life. For Lila, this park was a refuge, a corner of serenity in her otherwise hectic world. Seated on a wooden bench tucked near a tranquil pond, Lila took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air wash over her. She was a striking figure in her simplicity, her light sundress billowing slightly in the breeze and a shawl draped delicately over her shoulders. Her chestnut hair cascaded in loose waves, catching the sunlight as it swayed with her every movement. This was her moment of peace, one she seldom had time to enjoy. Her days were usually packed with deadlines, errands, and the demands of a life that never seemed to slow down. But today, she had carved out this small pocket of time, a precious gift to herself. The distant sound of children's laughter and the occasional chirping of birds blended into a soothing symphony. She closed her eyes for a moment, her mind drifting to her husband, Jonas, a man of great character and an unyielding sense of justice. Jonas worked tirelessly as the captain of the local police precinct, a position that demanded long hours and a resolve that often left him drained. But despite his busy schedule, he never failed to make Lila feel cherished. Their bond was built on mutual respect and understanding, a rare and unshakable connection. Lila glanced at her phone, considering sending Jonas a quick message. He had mentioned he might be able to finish early today, and she wanted to share this peaceful moment with him. Just as her fingers hovered over the screen, a shadow loomed beside her, blocking the fading sunlight. She looked up, startled, to see a tall man standing before her. His uniform, crisp and pristine, identified him as a police officer. His badge read Officer Carter, and he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth yet slightly too familiar. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" Lila forced a polite smile, her instincts on edge but her demeanor calm. "Yes, it is," she replied softly, hoping he would move along. But Carter didn't move. Instead, he gestured toward the empty space on the bench. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he didn't wait for an answer before lowering himself beside her. The bench creaked slightly under his weight as he settled far closer than Lila was comfortable with. His presence felt intrusive, his gaze lingering on her in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "I see you here often," Carter began, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "You come to the park to unwind?" Lila hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was off. She offered a neutral response, careful not to encourage further conversation. "Sometimes. It's a nice place to relax." He chuckled, leaning back slightly but not taking his eyes off her. "Not every day you see someone like you around here." The words hung in the air, laden with an uncomfortable insinuation. Lila shifted uneasily, inching away from him in the hopes he would take the hint. "Well," she said, her voice measured, "I'm just waiting for my husband." At that, Carter raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Husband, huh? Must be a lucky man." His hand rested casually on the bench, fingers inching closer to her leg. Lila's heart raced. She felt trapped, unsure of how to handle the situation without escalating it. She shifted again, her body tense as she tried to put more distance between them. But Carter didn't relent. His hand brushed against her knee, a seemingly accidental touch that was anything but. "Excuse me," Lila said firmly, her tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. I said I'm waiting for my husband. Carter's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a look of annoyance. I didn't mean to intrude, he said, though his hand didn't move. Instead, it slid further, his fingers grazing her leg in a way that made her stomach churn. Lila's patience snapped. She rose from the bench abruptly, her voice sharp and unwavering. I said, "Leave me alone." The suddenness of her movement seemed to catch Carter off guard, but only for a moment. His expression darkened, and before she could take another step, he reached out, grabbing her shoulder with a force that sent her stumbling. Her body hit the ground with a jarring thud, pain shooting through her wrist as she tried to break the fall. Dazed, she looked up to see Carter towering over her, his face twisted with anger. "Don't make a scene," he hissed, his voice low but dripping with menace. "You wouldn't want to cause any trouble, would you?" Lila's breath came in shallow gasps as she scrambled to her feet, cradling her injured wrist. Fear coursed through her, but she refused to back down. Just then, a voice called out from across the path, a voice she knew all too well. "Lila." Her head whipped around, and she saw Jonas striding toward them, his expression a mix of concern and fury. Relief flooded her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that things were about to get much more complicated. Jonas's eyes darted between his wife, bruised and shaken, and the officer standing menacingly close to her. The calm demeanor he usually carried was gone, replaced by a protective anger that seemed to radiate off him in waves. "What's going on here?" Jonas demanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. Carter's gaze shifted to Jonas, his smirk returning as he sized up the new arrival. "Stay out of it, buddy," he said dismissively. "This doesn't concern you." But Jonas didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "You don't know who you're talking to." For a brief moment Carter hesitated, the confidence in his stance wavering. But then his arrogance reasserted itself, and he sneered. "I don't care who you are," Carter shot back, his hand moving to his radio. "If you interfere with an officer, you're going to regret it." The tension crackled in the air like an electric charge. Lila could only watch, her heart pounding, as she realized that their peaceful evening had turned into something far more sinister. Carter's hand hovered over his radio, the device glinting ominously in the fading sunlight. His smirk, laced with condescension, was a silent challenge to Jonas. It was clear the officer wasn't accustomed to being questioned, let alone by someone who radiated such quiet authority. Jonas, however, remained unshaken. His towering frame seemed to expand with restrained energy, his stance firm and his eyes locked onto Carter's. Lila, cradling her injured wrist, stood frozen between them, her fear mingling with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Let me make myself clear," Jonas began, his voice steady yet brimming with controlled anger. "I'm not just someone you can push around. That's my wife you just assaulted." Carter raised an eyebrow, a mocking laugh escaping his lips. "Your wife?" He scoffed as though the word itself was absurd. Maybe she shouldn't have been so unfriendly. The insinuation sent a jolt through Jonas, but he resisted the urge to lash out. He knew better than to let his emotions take control, especially in a situation like this. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're crossing a line," Jonas warned, his tone dropping to a dangerous low. "And I promise, you'll regret it if you don't back off right now." But Carter wasn't the type to back down easily. He squared his shoulders, clearly misjudging Jonas's calm demeanor as weakness. "I've got authority here," Carter sneered, his fingers finally pressing the button on his radio. "You want to play tough guy? Let's see how that works out for you." The crackle of static filled the tense silence, followed by Carter's clipped voice. "Requesting backup at Central Park. We've got a civilian interfering with an officer's duties." Jonas's jaw tightened as he watched Carter's arrogance grow with every word. The officer was escalating the situation unnecessarily, using his position to twist the narrative. Jonas knew this tactic all too well. It was the kind of abuse of power he had spent his career fighting against. Lila took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please, stop this. He's not interfering, he's just trying to protect me." Carter turned to her, his expression hardening. "Stay out of this, lady. Your husband's the one making things worse." The words stung, but Lila refused to back down. She looked to Jonas, her eyes pleading. "Jonas, don't let him do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Jonas gave her a reassuring nod, his expression softening for the briefest moment. "I've got this," he said quietly, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens shattered the tense stillness of the park. 2 patrol cars pulled up along the winding path, their flashing lights painting the scene in harsh red and blue. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she watched the backup officers step out, their expressions a mix of confusion and authority as they approached. Carter, emboldened by their arrival, stepped forward and gestured toward Jonas with a smug grin. "That's him," he announced. "He's refusing to comply and interfering with an investigation." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain about the situation. Jonas's stature and composed demeanor didn't align with Carter's claims, and there was an air of discomfort in their movements. Jonas held up his hands, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not resisting," he said evenly, his gaze meeting each officer in turn. "But you're being lied to. This man assaulted my wife, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." The lead officer, a stocky man with a furrowed brow, hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jonas and Carter. "Is this true?" he asked Carter, his tone cautious. Carter's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "He's lying," he snapped. "This guy thinks he can intimidate me because of who he is. Arrest him." The hesitation among the officers was palpable, but their training kicked in. They advanced toward Jonas, their hands reaching for his arms. Lila cried out, rushing forward to intervene, but Carter stepped in her path, his hand gripping her shoulder firmly. "Don't make this harder for him," Carter growled, his voice low. "Let her go," Jonas barked, his voice sharper than before. The officers froze their grip on Jonas, loosening as they turned to look at Carter. It was clear they were beginning to sense that something was off, but the weight of protocol kept them from questioning their colleague outright. Carter, sensing his controls slipping, leaned into his role with renewed determination. "Do your job," he snapped at the officers. "Cuff him and take him in." Jonas didn't resist as they moved to restrain him, though their actions were unnecessarily rough. He felt the cold bite of handcuffs on his wrists and the pressure of his hands shoving him toward the ground. Despite the humiliation, he maintained his composure, refusing to give Carter the satisfaction of seeing him break. Lila's screams echoed in the background as she fought against Carter's grip, her voice pleading for someone to listen. "He didn't do anything wrong. Please, just listen to me." But her words fell on deaf ears. Carter watched with a twisted satisfaction as Jonas was forced to his knees, his cheek pressed against the rough pavement. "Maybe next time," Carter sneered, bending down so his face was level with Jonas's. "You'll think twice before sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Jonas turned his head slightly, meeting Carter's gaze with a steely resolve that refused to waver. "And maybe next time," Jonas replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "You'll think twice before abusing your badge." Carter's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a cold laugh. "Take him away," he barked, stepping back as the officers hauled Jonas to his feet. Lila, tears streaming down her face, could only watch as her husband was led toward one of the patrol cars. Carter released his grip on her shoulder, his expression one of condescension as he addressed her. "Looks like you'll have to wait a while for him to get back," he said mockingly. "Better get comfortable." Lila's hands trembled with helpless rage as she watched Jonas disappear into the back of the car. The door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo in her chest, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. As the cars pulled away, Lila made a silent vow. This wasn't over. She would Carter's abuse of power go unchecked, and she wouldn't rest until Jonas was free. The patrol car sped through the quiet streets, its flashing lights illuminating the buildings they passed. In the back seat, Jonas sat upright, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, the cold metal digging into his wrists. His jaw was clenched, not out of fear, but from the sheer frustration of knowing this situation was entirely avoidable, had Carter not abused his authority. Through the rear window, the lights of the park faded into the distance. The image of Lila standing alone, her face etched with fear and anguish, burned into his memory. Jonas shut his eyes briefly, drawing on years of training to calm his breathing. This wasn't over, and he would make sure Carter faced justice, no matter what it took. In the front seat, Officers Reed and Bennett exchanged uneasy glances. The tension between them was palpable. While they had complied with Carter's orders, it was clear they weren't entirely convinced of the legitimacy of the arrest. "Something about this feels wrong," Reed muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. Bennett shot him a warning look, his voice low but firm. "Don't start, Reed. Carter gave the order, and it's not our place to question it." Reed hesitated, his knuckles whitening as he adjusted his grip. "Still, you can't tell me this guy looks like someone who'd cause trouble." Jonas, sensing the internal conflict brewing, leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "You know this isn't right," he said, his tone steady but laced with quiet authority. "You're being used to cover up Carter's mistakes." Bennett didn't turn around, but Jonas could see the man's shoulders tense. Reed, however, glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Jonas's. There was a flicker of doubt there, a hesitation that spoke volumes. "Look," Jonas continued, his voice calm and deliberate. "I know what it's like to be in your position. You think you're just following orders, but deep down, you know those orders are wrong. Don't let Carter drag you down with him." Reed's gaze lingered in the mirror for a moment longer before he quickly looked away. Bennett let out a heavy sigh, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Just keep quiet back there," Bennett said gruffly, though his voice lacked the conviction of someone fully convinced of his actions. The car pulled into the precinct's underground parking garage, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the cement walls. Jonas braced himself as the doors opened and the two officers moved to pull him out. Their grip was firm but not unnecessarily rough, a small mercy, perhaps a sign that Jonas's words had struck a chord. The air inside the garage was stale and heavy, and there was a sense of foreboding. Jonas's boots scuffed against the concrete as he was led toward an unmarked elevator at the far end of the space. "Where are you taking me?" Jonas asked, his voice even. Reed hesitated, his hand twitching slightly on Jonas's arm, but Bennett answered without missing a beat. "You'll see soon enough." The elevator ride was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. Jonas could feel the tension radiating off the officers as they stood on either side of him. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to show any sign of weakness. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a dimly lit corridor. The air here was colder, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. Jonas recognized the area immediately. It was one of the precinct's older interrogation wings, rarely used except for cases requiring absolute discretion. His stomach tightened. Whatever Carter had planned, it wasn't going to follow standard protocol. The officers led him to a small, windowless room at the end of the hall. Inside, a single metal chair bolted to the floor sat beneath a dim overhead light. The walls were bare, the cement cold and unwelcoming. Reed hesitated again as he unlocked Jonas's cuffs, his hand hovering as if unsure whether to proceed. Bennett, however, was more decisive. He unceremoniously pushed Jonas into the chair, securing his hands to metal loops attached to the armrests. "You don't have to do this," Jonas said, addressing Reed directly. "You know this isn't how things are supposed to be done." Reed's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He stepped back, his gaze flickering briefly to Bennett, who gave him a curt nod. "Wait here," Bennett said, his tone clipped. As the door closed behind them, Jonas was left alone in the oppressive silence. The cold metal of the chair bit into his skin, and the restraints dug into his wrists, but he ignored the discomfort. His mind raced, analyzing every detail of the situation, every possible way to turn this in his favor. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door swung open again. Carter strode in, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He crossed his arms, leaning casually against the wall as he surveyed Jonas. "Well, look who we have here," Carter sneered. "Captain Jonas, all tied up and powerless. How's it feel?" Jonas met his gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. "You're making a mistake, Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Carter's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, I think it will. You see, you've been a thorn in my side ever since you showed up. Always acting like you're better than the rest of us. Well, guess what? In here, you're nothing." He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think that badge makes you untouchable? Think again. Jonas didn't flinch, didn't react. He knew Carter was trying to provoke him, to elicit any response that could be used against him. Instead, he held Carter's gaze, his silence a quiet act of defiance. Carter's expression darkened, his frustration growing as Jonas refused to play along. "You're going to regret crossing me," he hissed, "and when I'm done with you, no one's going to care about your little sob story." He straightened, his smirk returning as he turned toward the door. "Enjoy your stay, Captain," he said over his shoulder. "You might be here for a while." Bookmark. As the door slammed shut, Jonas took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but he knew he couldn't afford to let it consume him. This was far from over, and he would find a way to turn the tide. The dim room grew colder as Jonas sat restrained, his hands tightly cuffed to the metal loops on the chair's armrests. The silence pressed down on him, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Despite the physical discomfort, the ache in his wrists, the sharp pain radiating from his ribs where Carter's earlier assault had left bruises, Jonas's mind remained sharp. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a man with a purpose, and he would endure whatever came next to see justice served. Minutes felt like hours as he waited. His gaze moved methodically around the small room, taking in every detail. The dull gray walls, the faint stain on the floor near the corner, the weak flicker of the overhead bulb. He committed it all to memory. Each piece of this grim setting was evidence of the corruption that had brought him here. Finally, the door creaked open. 2 officers entered, their faces unreadable, followed closely by Carter. The smug expression on Carter's face hadn't waned. If anything, it had grown more pronounced. "Looks like you're enjoying our accommodations, Captain," Carter sneered, leaning casually against the wall. "How's it feel to be on the other side of things for once?" Jonas met his gaze without flinching, his expression calm but resolute. "You're digging your own grave, Carter," he said evenly. "Everything you've done tonight will come to light. It's only a matter of time." Carter's smirk faltered for a split second before he masked it with a cold laugh. "You've got a lot of nerve, talking like that when you're the one in cuffs," he shot back. He turned to the 2 officers who had accompanied him. "Let's make sure our guest feels welcome. Teach him what happens when you cross the wrong person." The officers exchanged a brief glance, hesitation flickering in their eyes. Jonas caught it immediately, an opening, however small. But their reluctance was short-lived as Carter's commanding glare pushed them into action. The first officer stepped forward, his jaw tight as he raised a fist. Jonas braced himself, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. The punch landed squarely on his jaw, snapping his head to the side. A metallic taste filled his mouth as he bit down against the pain. Another blow followed, this time to his ribs. Jonas's breath hitched, the pain sharp and immediate, but still he didn't cry out. His silence was a shield, a way to deny them the power they sought over him. "Is that all you've got?" Jonas said hoarsely, his voice defiant even as the pain radiated through his body. Carter's smirk widened. "Tough guy, huh? Let's see how long that lasts." The assault continued, each blow deliberate and punishing. The officers avoided his face after the initial strike, likely under Carter's orders to keep any visible injuries minimal. But Jonas knew the bruises forming beneath his shirt would tell their own story. A story of abuse, of corruption, of everything Carter stood for. Through it all, Jonas remained steadfast. His breaths came in shallow gasps and his muscles screamed in protest, but his spirit refused to break. He thought of Lila, her strength, her unwavering support, and it fueled his resolve. Eventually, Carter raised a hand, signaling the officers to stop. Jonas slumped slightly in the chair, his body aching, but his gaze remained fixed on Carter. "You think you're making a point, Carter?" Jonas said, his voice strained but steady. "All you're doing is proving how far you'll go to cover your own failures." Carter's eyes narrowed, the smirk fading into a cold scowl. He stepped closer, leaning down until his face was mere inches from Jonas's. "You don't get it, do you?" Carter hissed. "In here, I'm the one in control. No one's coming to save you. You're just another loudmouth who thought he could get away with disrespecting me." Jonas didn't blink. His expression was unwavering. "You're not as untouchable as you think," he replied quietly. The words seemed to strike a nerve. Carter straightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Leave him," he barked at the officers. "Let him sit here and think about his place." The officers hesitated briefly before stepping back. They followed Carter out of the room, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind them. As the silence returned, Jonas let out a slow breath. His body ached with every movement, but his mind was sharper than ever. He knew Carter was wrong. He wasn't alone in this fight. Lila was out there, and she wouldn't stop until the truth came out. Bookmark. Meanwhile, back at the park, Lila stood frozen in place, her heart pounding as the patrol cars disappeared into the distance. Her wrist throbbed painfully where Carter had grabbed her, but she barely noticed. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the last hour in vivid detail. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she fumbled to unlock it. The first person she called was Jonas's deputy, Officer Riley, a trusted colleague who had always spoken highly of Jonas's integrity. "Riley," Lila said, her voice shaking, "Jonas has been arrested. It's Carter. He attacked me and then framed Jonas for interfering." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Riley's voice came through, steady and determined. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm at the park," Lila replied, glancing around as though expecting Carter to return at any moment. "But Jonas, he's been taken to the precinct. You have to help him." "I'll handle it," Riley assured her. "Stay put for now. I'll make some calls." Lila hung up, her grip tightening on the phone. She knew Riley would do everything in his power to help, but she couldn't just wait. Jonas needed her, and she wasn't about to let Carter's abuse of power go unchecked. She glanced around the park, her eyes landing on a small group of bystanders who had witnessed part of the altercation. One of them, a young man holding a smartphone, was reviewing a video on his screen. "Excuse me," Lila said, approaching him quickly. "Were you recording earlier?" The man looked up, his expression wary but sympathetic. "Yeah," he admitted. "I saw what that cop did to you. It's all here." "Can I see it?" Lila asked, her voice urgent. He handed her the phone, and she watched the footage with a mix of anger and relief. It was all there. Carter's aggressive behavior, his blatant disregard for protocol, and his assault on Jonas. This was the evidence they needed, proof of Carter's corruption. "Can you send this to me?" Lila asked, her eyes locking onto his. The man hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course. Someone has to do something about that guy." As Lila received the video, a renewed sense of determination surged through her. She wasn't powerless. She had the truth on her side, and she would use it to bring Carter down. Back at the precinct, Jonas remained in the chair, his breathing steady despite the pain coursing through him. The door opened again, and this time, it wasn't Carter who entered. It was Officer Reed. Reed hesitated at the threshold, his expression conflicted. He closed the door quietly behind him and approached Jonas, his movements cautious. "What do you want?" Jonas asked, his voice low but calm. Reed glanced over his shoulder as though ensuring no one was watching. Then, in a hushed tone, he said, "Look, I don't agree with what's happening here. Carter's pushing things too far." Jonas raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Then do something about it." Reed's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he might walk away. But then he nodded, a flicker of resolve crossing his face. "I'll see what I can do," he said quietly before slipping out of the room. Jonas watched him go, a faint glimmer of hope sparking within him. The cracks in Carter's facade were beginning to show, and Jonas knew it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. Lila sat in her car outside the precinct, the glow from her phone screen illuminating her determined expression. The video evidence she'd received was undeniable. Every detail of Carter's misconduct, from his harassment to the unjust arrest of Jonas, was captured with startling clarity. The bystander who had filmed the incident had done so with a steady hand, ensuring nothing was left to interpretation. She quickly uploaded the video to her cloud storage, backing it up in multiple locations. She wasn't going to take any chances. Once the file was secure, she began composing a message to a local journalist she followed on social media. The journalist, Sandra Cho, was known for her hard-hitting investigations and unwavering commitment to exposing corruption. "Hello, Sandra," Lila typed, her hands trembling with urgency. I have video evidence of police misconduct involving an officer named Carter and my husband Jonas, who's a precinct captain. Please help me expose this. I can send the video immediately." Within moments, her phone buzzed with a reply. "Send it over," Sandra wrote. "If it's as serious as you say, I'll make sure it gets out. This kind of behavior can't go unchecked." Lila attached the video and hit send, her breath hitching as she watched the file upload. She knew this was a risky move. Carter and those loyal to him might retaliate, but she couldn't let fear stop her. Jonas had always fought for justice, and now it was her turn to do the same. Inside the precinct, Jonas remained seated in the interrogation room. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. His body ached from the earlier assault, but his mind was sharp, his thoughts focused on finding a way out of this situation. The door opened again, and this time, Officer Reed stepped inside. He closed the door behind him, his movements careful and deliberate. Jonas regarded him with quiet curiosity, sensing a shift in the younger officer's demeanor. Reed hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Captain, I don't know how to say this, but things are escalating fast out there." Jonas's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Reed pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen before holding it up for Jonas to see. On the screen was a news alert, accompanied by the video Lila had shared with Sandra Cho. The footage had already gone viral, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets. "The video," Reed continued, his voice low. "It's everywhere. People are outraged. They're calling for an investigation." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Jonas's face, though he kept his expression mostly neutral. "Good," he said simply. Reed's gaze darted nervously toward the door. "Carter doesn't know yet, but it won't be long before he finds out. The chief's already been notified, and there's a meeting happening upstairs as we speak." Jonas leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "And where do you stand in all of this, Officer Reed? Are you going to keep following Carter's orders, or are you ready to do what's right?" Reed hesitated, his jaw tightening. It was clear he was wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he nodded, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "I'm not going to let this go any further. But we need to move carefully. Carter still has allies in the precinct, and if he feels cornered, he'll lash out." Jonas studied him for a moment before giving a single nod. "Then let's make sure we're ready when he does." Meanwhile, upstairs in the chief's office, a heated discussion was underway. Chief Anderson, a seasoned leader known for his no-nonsense approach, sat behind his desk, his expression grim as he reviewed the viral video on a tablet. Across from him stood Carter, his usually smug demeanor replaced by a thin veneer of composure. "This doesn't look good, Carter," Anderson said, his tone sharp. "I've got reporters calling, the public demanding answers, and a precinct full of officers who are starting to ask questions." Carter crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "That video doesn't tell the whole story. The guy in it, Jonas, he was interfering with an active investigation." Anderson's eyes narrowed as he set the tablet down. "Interfering?" he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "From what I see, he was defending his wife from your inappropriate behavior. Explain to me how shoving a civilian to the ground and then arresting her husband without cause qualifies as an investigation." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Anderson held up a hand to silence him. "Enough," Anderson said firmly. "I've already authorized an internal investigation, and until it's completed, you're suspended effective immediately." Carter's face flushed with anger. "You're taking his side?" he spat. "After everything I've done for this precinct?" Anderson stood, his imposing presence filling the room. "I'm not taking sides, Carter. I'm doing my job, something you seem to have forgotten how to do. Now get out of my office before I have you escorted out." Carter glared at him, his fists clenched at his sides, but he knew better than to argue further. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Downstairs, the atmosphere in the precinct was charged with tension. Officers whispered among themselves, their glances darting toward the interrogation wing where Jonas was being held. The video had changed everything, and the once dominant narrative crafted by Carter was rapidly unraveling. Lila entered the precinct, her chin held high despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She approached the front desk, her voice steady but firm as she addressed the officer on duty. "I'm here to see Captain Jonas," she said. The officer hesitated, clearly aware of the unfolding situation, but unsure how to proceed. Before he could respond, Riley appeared, his expression one of quiet determination. "Lila," he said, nodding to her. "Come with me. We're getting him out of there." As they moved toward the interrogation wing, Riley spoke in hushed tones. "The video worked. The chief's already taken action against Carter, and I've got clearance to release Jonas. But be careful. Carter's still in the building, and he's not going to take this lying down." When they reached the room, Riley unlocked the door and stepped inside. Jonas looked up, his expression softening as his eyes met Lila's. "Jonas," Lila said, rushing to his side. "Are you okay?" "I've been better," he admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion but laced with gratitude. Riley unlocked the cuffs, freeing Jonas from the chair. As he stood, Lila reached out to steady him, her touch a balm to the bruises, both visible and unseen. "We need to move quickly," Riley said. "Carter's still a threat, and we don't know what he'll try next." Jonas nodded, his mind already shifting into action mode. "Let's go." As they exited the room, the precinct seemed to come alive with activity. Officers moved with purpose, their expressions a mix of apprehension and resolve. Carter was nowhere to be seen, but Jonas knew the man wouldn't go quietly. Lila walked beside him, her presence a source of strength. Together they headed for the chief's office, determined to see this fight through to the end. The precinct was a hive of tension and quiet urgency as Jonas, Lila, and Riley moved through the corridors. The echoes of their footsteps on the tiled floor seemed louder than usual, each step a reminder that the battle for justice wasn't over. Jonas's body ached, but his mind was razor-sharp, processing every detail of the situation. The viral video had shifted the tide in their favor, but Carter was still a dangerous wildcard. Jonas knew the disgraced officer wouldn't back down easily, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. As they approached the chief's office, the door swung open and Chief Anderson emerged, his expression stern but resolute. His eyes immediately landed on Jonas, and a flicker of relief passed over his face. "Captain Jonas," Anderson said, extending a hand. "I'm glad to see you're free. I'm deeply sorry for what's happened." Jonas shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Chief," he replied. "But this isn't just about me. Carter's abuse of power has gone unchecked for too long. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Anderson nodded, his gaze steady. "I agree. I've already suspended Carter pending a full investigation. The department's reputation is at stake, and I won't tolerate corruption within our ranks." Lila stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Chief, thank you for acting, but you need to understand how far Carter went. He didn't just abuse his authority. He targeted my husband because he thought he could get away with it. He thought no one would stand up to him." Anderson's jaw tightened. "And he was wrong," he said firmly. "I've called for an emergency meeting with Internal Affairs to address this. Jonas, I'd like you to be part of it." Jonas nodded, grateful for the opportunity to contribute. "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure justice is served." Anderson stepped aside, gesturing for them to follow him into his office. As they entered, Jonas noticed the room was already prepared for the meeting. A conference table stood in the center, papers and tablets neatly arranged, and a screen on the wall displayed the now viral video that had exposed Carter's actions. Riley stayed by the door, his posture alert as if expecting trouble at any moment. Lila took a seat beside Jonas, her presence a steady anchor amidst the storm. Bookmark. Meanwhile, in another part of the precinct, Carter paced furiously in an empty break room. His once confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of the evidence against him. The video, the public outrage, and now the chief's decision to suspend him. It was all unraveling too quickly for him to regain control. He slammed a fist onto the counter, the sound echoing off the walls. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd built his career on intimidation and manipulation, always staying one step ahead of those who dared to challenge him. But now, for the first time, he felt cornered. Carter's mind raced as he considered his options. He still had a few loyal allies within the precinct, officers who shared his mindset or owed him favors. If he acted quickly, he might be able to salvage some semblance of control. Pulling out his phone, Carter dialed a number, his voice low and urgent. "Meet me by the service exit," he said. "We've got a problem to handle." Back in the chief's office, the meeting began with Anderson addressing the group. Jonas listened intently as the chief outlined the steps being taken to address the situation, including the suspension of Carter and the launch of a comprehensive investigation into his conduct. "We have a responsibility to restore trust in this department," Anderson said. "That starts with holding people like Carter accountable." Jonas leaned forward, his voice steady but resolute. "It's not just about Carter. This kind of behavior doesn't happen in isolation. He's had enablers, people who turned a blind eye or actively supported him. If we're serious about change, we need to root out everyone involved." Anderson nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. The investigation will go beyond Carter. We'll look into every incident, every complaint, and ensure that those who've abused their power face the consequences." As the discussion continued, Lila found herself marveling at Jonas's composure. Despite everything he'd endured, he remained focused on the bigger picture, using his experience to push for meaningful reform. She felt a swell of pride, knowing she had married a man who stood unwaveringly for what was right. Unbeknownst to those in the meeting, Carter was putting his plan into motion. He met two officers near the service exit, their faces tense but resolute. They were part of the old guard, officers who had benefited from Carter's corrupt methods, and now found themselves tethered to his sinking ship. "This is our last chance to control the narrative," Carter said, his voice low but intense. "We can't let Jonas or the chief dictate what happens next." One of the officers, a stocky man named Fleming, frowned. "What are you suggesting, Carter? The whole department's watching us now. We can't just make this go away." Carter's eyes flashed with frustration. "We don't need to make it go away," he snapped. "We just need to muddy the waters, plant some doubt, make Jonas look less like a hero and more like a liability." The second officer, a wiry man named Odell, hesitated. "That's risky. If we get caught—" "We won't get caught," Carter interrupted. "But if you're too scared to act, then maybe you're not cut out for this." Fleming and Odell exchanged uneasy glances before reluctantly nodding. Carter's plan was desperate, but they had already come too far to back out now. As the meeting in the chief's office continued, an urgent knock at the door interrupted the discussion. Riley opened it to find another officer, his expression serious. "Chief, we've got a situation," the officer said. "Carter's been seen near the service exit with two other officers. It looks like he's planning something." Anderson's face darkened. "Lock down the precinct," he ordered. "I want Carter and anyone working with him brought in immediately." Riley nodded and stepped out to carry out the order. Jonas stood, his body protesting the movement, but his resolve unshaken. "I'm going with you," Jonas said, his voice firm. Anderson hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Be careful. Carter's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." The lockdown was swift, with officers moving efficiently to secure exits and hallways. Jonas, accompanied by Riley and a small team of loyal officers, made his way toward the service exit. As they rounded a corner, they spotted Carter and his accomplices. The three men froze, their expressions a mix of defiance and panic. "It's over, Carter," Jonas called out, his voice carrying authority. "Put your hands up and step away from the door." Carter's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you've won, Jonas? This isn't over." Fleming and Odell exchanged uncertain glances before reluctantly raising their hands. But Carter remained defiant, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "Don't do it," Jonas warned, his voice steady. "You're only making things worse for yourself." For a moment, it seemed Carter might comply. But then, with a sudden movement, he reached for his weapon. Before he could draw it, Riley and another officer moved in, disarming him with practiced efficiency. Carter struggled, his shouts echoing down the corridor, but it was futile. Within seconds, he was restrained, his face red with anger and humiliation. As Carter was led away, Jonas felt a wave of relief. The man who had caused so much harm was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Back in the main precinct, the mood was tense but hopeful. Officers who had once feared Carter's influence now began to see a path forward, a chance to rebuild trust and integrity within their ranks. Chief Anderson addressed the department later that evening, his voice carrying a sense of resolve. "Today, we took the first step toward restoring the values this department stands for. Let this be a reminder to all of us: no one is above the law, and justice will always prevail." Jonas stood with Lila at the back of the room, her hand resting gently in his. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. The sun was rising over the city, its warm golden light spilling across the precinct's parking lot as Jonas and Lila stood side by side, letting the cool morning air fill their lungs. The events of the last 24 hours had left their marks, physically on Jonas, with bruises that throbbed with every movement, and emotionally on both of them. But as they stood there together, there was a shared sense of triumph. Lila looked up at Jonas, her eyes reflecting both pride and concern. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Seeing you like that, knowing what they were doing to you, and not being able to stop it. It was unbearable." Jonas placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but reassuring. "You did stop it, Lila," he said. "You're the reason Carter's been exposed. That video, it changed everything." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I just couldn't let him win," she whispered. "Not after everything he put us through." Jonas nodded, his gaze shifting to the precinct building behind them. "He didn't win," he said firmly. "And he never will." Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of relief and cautious optimism. The officers who had once feared Carter's influence were now reflecting on their roles within the department. The viral video sparked not only public outrage but also an internal reckoning. Chief Anderson stood in the main assembly room, addressing the gathered officers. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "What happened here is a stark reminder of the responsibility we carry as law enforcement officers," he began. "We swore to serve and protect, but somewhere along the way, some of us lost sight of what that means." His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of every officer present. Carter abused his power, and those who enabled him failed this department, but today marks the beginning of a new chapter. There will be accountability, there will be reform, and together we will rebuild the trust that has been damaged. The room was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others reflecting on their own actions or inactions. Jonas and Lila stood near the back of the room, watching as Anderson spoke. Jonas felt a swell of gratitude for the chief's resolve, but he knew this was only the beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Later that morning, Jonas met with Anderson in his office. The chief leaned back in his chair, studying Jonas with a thoughtful expression. "You've been through hell, Jonas," Anderson said, his voice tinged with regret. "And yet you've handled it with more integrity than most people would in your position." Jonas shook his head. "I did what needed to be done," he replied. "This department deserves better, and so do the people we serve." Anderson nodded. "I agree. That's why I want you to play a key role in the reforms we're implementing. We need leaders who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Jonas considered the chief's words, his mind flashing back to the events of the previous day. The pain, the humiliation, the fear, but also the resilience, the support of his wife, and the undeniable power of the truth. "I'm in," Jonas said firmly, "whatever it takes." Meanwhile, Carter sat alone in a holding cell, his usual smug confidence replaced by a simmering anger. He replayed the events in his mind, searching for a way to shift the blame, to regain the control he'd lost. But no matter how he twisted the narrative, he couldn't escape the reality of the situation. The video had been damning, and the public outcry was growing louder by the hour. Journalists were camped outside the precinct, demanding statements. Social media was ablaze with calls for accountability. Carter's name had become synonymous with corruption, and his once loyal allies were beginning to distance themselves. As the hours dragged on, Carter's bravado began to crumble. For the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, not just the immediate fallout, but the years of abuse and misconduct that had finally caught up with him. Back at home, Jonas and Lila sat together in their living room, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. The familiarity of the space, a framed photo of their wedding day on the mantel, the worn but comfortable couch they'd spent countless evenings on, offered a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. Lila handed Jonas a cup of coffee, her hand lingering on his for a moment. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked quietly. Jonas took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through him. "For Carter? Yes," he said. "But for the department, for all of us, it's just beginning. Change takes time, but I believe it's coming." Lila nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope this makes a difference," she said. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been hurt by someone like Carter." "It will," Jonas assured her. "People are paying attention now, and as long as we keep pushing for accountability, things will get better." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the previous day gradually giving way to a sense of peace. Over the next several weeks, the reforms Anderson had promised began to take shape. Officers underwent mandatory training on ethics and bias. Complaints against misconduct were reviewed with renewed scrutiny. Policies were updated to ensure greater transparency and accountability. Jonas played an active role in these efforts, his experience serving as a powerful reminder of what was at stake. He worked closely with Anderson and other leaders to rebuild trust within the department and the community it served. The process wasn't without its challenges. There were those who resisted the changes, clinging to the old ways out of fear or complacency. But for every obstacle, there was also progress, a small victory that signaled a brighter future. Lila continued to be Jonas's greatest source of strength. She attended community meetings, spoke with activists, and shared her story to raise awareness about the importance of holding those in power accountable. Together, they became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. One evening, as Jonas and Lila walked hand in hand through the park where it had all begun, they paused by the bench where Carter had first confronted her. The memory was still fresh, but it no longer carried the same weight. "Feels different now," Lila said, her voice soft. Jonas nodded, his gaze sweeping over the tranquil scene, the golden hues of the setting sun, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. "It does," he agreed, "because we didn't let him win." Lila leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And we never will." As they stood there, a sense of closure settled over them. The fight for justice was far from over, but they had taken the first steps toward a better future. Together, they were stronger. Unshaken by adversity, united by their shared belief in the power of truth and love. The story of Jonas and Lila isn't just about one man's fight against corruption. It's a testament to the power of resilience, love, and truth. It shines a light on the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. Jonas's unyielding determination to protect his wife and expose injustice is a powerful reminder that integrity can triumph over abuse of power, no matter how deeply rooted. Lila's role in this journey is equally inspiring. Her quick thinking and refusal to back down, even when she felt powerless, were what turned the tide. She showed us the strength that comes from standing by your loved ones and the impact one voice can have when it calls for justice. Together, they demonstrated that change is possible when people work together and refuse to accept the unacceptable. This story isn't just about holding one bad officer accountable. It's about creating a ripple effect of accountability and reform. It reminds us all that true justice isn't passive. It demands action, courage, and persistence. If this story moved you or inspired you, let us know. Type 1 in the comments if you found it compelling, or type 2 if it resonated deeply with you. We'd also love to hear your own stories of resilience and courage. What have you faced that required standing up for what's right? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay connected with more stories like this, stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of justice and love. Your voice matters, and your engagement helps us share these messages with others. See you in the next video.